a commercial airliner was flying from San Francisco to Los Angeles when it developed some mechanical problems and had to make an unexpected stop in Sacramento. The crew announced to the passengers that they were going to be there for at least an hour, and they were welcome to get out of the plane to go into the terminal and stretch their legs. Most of them did. The pilot, when he got off the plane, he noticed that there was a passenger who actually flew that same route very frequently, and the pilot knew him by name. The passenger was blind, and he was sitting in his seat, and he had his seeing eye dog stretched out at his feet. So he went up to the passenger and he said, "Dan, listen, do you want to get out now and stretch your legs?" And the passenger said, "No, I'm fine, but my dog really needs to stretch his legs, so would you mind just taking my dog for a walk?" And the pilot said, "I'd be happy to. I love dogs. I'd be happy to do it." So the pilot got off the plane, still had his sunglasses on, and he had the seeing eye dog walking off as he got off the plane. And many of the passengers were right there in the gate area when they saw the pilot with his sunglasses and the seeing eye dog come walking off of the plane. The word is that they were scrambling to get on another plane and another flight, and most likely another airline altogether, because nobody wants a blind pilot. Nobody wants a blind guide. Now, here's the great irony about Paul, because we're going to start a study today on the life of Paul. And Paul is one of the great leaders in all of history, but before he could become a leader, God struck him blind. Isn't that ironic? Nobody wants a blind leader, but God had to strike Paul blind before he could be a leader. The fact is, he had to learn to be led before he could be a great leader of other people. I want to ask you this morning, if you were to be asked, why study the life of Paul? There's a lot of reasons people give. If I said, why should we take the next 8 weeks or so to study the life of Paul? Why should we devote that much time to this one person? One of the best answers that people give is the fact that Paul is the second most important person in the history of Christianity, second only to Jesus Christ himself. In fact, you could make a very good case that he's the second most important person in all of history, not just the history of Christianity, but in all of history, second only to Christ himself. So there alone would be good enough reason to say we should study the life of Paul. Another reason would be to say that Paul took the message of Christianity, the message that Jesus taught and taught his disciples. Paul was the one who took it to virtually the whole Roman Empire, which is pretty much the whole known world, in his lifetime. Arguably the greatest missionary in the history of the church. And for that reason alone, you could say it'd be worth it to study the life of Paul. But another reason, if those two aren't good enough, is that Paul is the author of most of the the New Testament. Most of the letters that you find in the New Testament were written by Paul, mostly written from prison. And it seems that God had to occasionally get Paul arrested and put him in prison so he could take some time and write some letters. As he went around to all of the known world, he planted churches everywhere he went. And those churches prospered and grew. And then when he was in prison, he would write letters back to all of those churches, to the church in Ephesus and the church in Philippi. And he'd write letters to all of those churches. And those letters now are instructions on how to put the Christian faith into practice. And what's the proper doctrine, the right beliefs. And those letters now have been studied and read for 2,000 years, and we study them all the time. That would be reason enough to study the life of Paul, the fact that he wrote most of the New Testament. But there's another reason that, for me personally, would be compelling to study the life of Paul, and that is that Paul is very rare of all human beings. I think there's only a handful who can make this claim. And that is that Paul discovered the secret to contentment. My observation in watching people is that the vast majority of people are discontent. And discontentment robs you of your joy, it robs you of your peace. But Paul discovered the secret of contentment. He actually says that in the letter that he wrote to the Philippians. It's this one verse, chapter 4, verse 12 in Philippians. He said, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. See, it's easy for people to be content sometimes when life is going good and they have everything they need to eat and their material needs are good and their health is good. But the great secret that Paul discovered was how to be content when he was hungry, when he was in prison, when he didn't have anything, when everything was going wrong. Paul was perfectly content. And there are very few people that can say that. And I think that reason alone makes me want to study this man and say, what was that secret? Because that's the word he uses. I have learned the secret of being content. I have a feeling that today, if we were to write a book and put it out there, The Secret to Contentment, I think it'd be a big seller. If people thought that somehow buried in these pages, I'm going to come across 3 easy steps or some simple statement that's going to be the keep us content, I think people would buy that book. But Paul knows the secret, so I want to study Paul just to see if I can uncover that secret that he did. The reason that discontentment is so devastating to people is that they can't enjoy what they have because they always want more. When I was working with high school students and Youth for Christ, running campus life clubs, one of the games that we would do with these kids is I'd divide the group into teams with about 10 people on a team. And I'd give each team a penny because that's just how generous I am. Give each team a penny. And I would tell them to go down the street in different directions. We'd meet in people's homes and neighborhoods. And to go in all different directions. And they were to go house to house. Each team did this. They'd knock on the first door, and whoever answered the house, they'd say, I would like to trade you this penny for something that's bigger and better than this. Anything you want to give me that's bigger and better than the penny. And the people would give them something. It could be anything. It could be an egg. And they go, thank you. And they take that to the next house and knock on the door and say, I'd like to trade you this egg for something that's bigger and better. And the person would give them like a shoe, anything bigger and better. And they go to the next house and they give them like a pillow, fine. It was almost always junk that people wanted to get rid of. And they were delighted to see the kids go, oh, sure, I've got something for you. And they would be gone for about a half hour, and they'd come back to the house where we started. And it was amazing to see what they brought back. Without exaggerating, I had teams of kids bring back full-size canoes. They would be over the top of the team. They'd all be carrying them back, working canoes with paddles and everything. I had kids bring back washing machines and working stereos and bicycles and amazing things that they started with a penny. And they just get something bigger and better and bigger and better. And then we had a discussion with the students after they did that about how the whole world is on a bigger and better hunt. And that it's a lot of fun to do that as a game, but it's a terrible way to go through your life. If you're on a hunt always looking for something bigger and better, you're heading toward discontent because you will never be happy with what you have because you think there's something out there that's better, there's something out there that's bigger, and you're always going to want more. That is discontent. Paul learned the secret of being content with what he had. And I think that's worth studying Paul for that reason alone. One of the things that God taught Paul early on that would lead him to this secret of contentment, I'm giving you a hint here, is that God is in control. God made that very clear to Paul the first time they met, and Paul would never forget that. The first time that we meet Paul in Scripture is in Acts chapter 8. I have a few of the verses we'll put up in front of you from Acts chapter 8. And he's referred to here by his Hebrew name, which is Saul. Paul was a devout Jew, and his Hebrew name was Saul. And in this chapter, he's referred to as Saul. Later on, when he would go to all the Greeks and teach them about Jesus, he would be called by his Greek name, which is Paul. But in Acts 8, it says, and Saul approved of the killing of him. Now, that's referring to Stephen, the first martyr in the Christian church who was stoned to death. And Paul stood right there. In fact, the people who were stoning Stephen laid their coats at the feet of Saul, and he gave approval to this whole thing. And then it goes on to say that on that day a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him, but Saul began to destroy the church. Listen, look at that line. That's an amazing statement. Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Well, first of all, Saul was the greatest enemy of the church at that day. He was a devout Jew, and he was determined to destroy the church. He was not doing it because he was evil. He was doing it because he was godly. Can you imagine that? He was out to destroy the church because he was such a godly man. How could that be? Well, Paul grew up as a Jew in Tarsus. Tarsus was known for all kinds of things, among which was a great center for education. And Paul received his education as a Jew at the feet of the greatest rabbi in the world at that time, a man named Gamaliel. The greatest teacher in the world. And Paul was the best student of the best teacher. He was the Jew of all Jews. He knew as much as a person could know about Judaism and the Old Testament. He was a great, great leader for Jews. Very young man, at this point maybe 25, 26 years old, but he was driven. But he was driven because of his love for God and his love for his Jewish faith. And when he heard that there was a group of people who believed that this man named Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah, Paul was convinced, like most other Jews, that this was a false Messiah. There had been many false Messiahs who'd come and gone. But this group seemed to be getting traction. They seemed to be attracting followers. There were people leaving the Jewish faith to go follow this false Messiah named Jesus. And it just riled Paul to no end that people were being led astray. And he believed that the best thing he could do to serve God was to destroy this cult called Christians. And so he went out to destroy the church because of his love for God and his love for his Jewish faith. And Paul didn't do anything part way. He went full force, and he became the number one guy who was persecuting and arresting Christians to put him in prison. In Acts chapter 9, just to show you how devoted Paul was to arresting Christians, in Acts chapter 9, he gets a list of all the Christians in Damascus, and he sets off to go arrest those Christians in Damascus. Do you know how far this trip was for him to go to Damascus? It was 135 miles. It's at least a 2-week journey to get there to arrest these Christians. How devoted do you have to be to go that far just to put people in prison? But that's how devoted Paul was. He was 100% committed to destroying the church, and he was going to root them out wherever they were, and he was going to put them in jail and kill them if necessary to destroy the church. The people in the church were terrified of Paul, as you can imagine. While he was on his way to Damascus, he was blinded by the light. And that story is told in Acts chapter 9. We're going to look at the first 9 verses of Acts chapter 9 and see how the great enemy of the church met the head of the church in Acts chapter 9. Luke is writing this account, of course, in Acts, and he writes, "Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way," that's the Christians, the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting," he replied. "Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do." The men traveling with Saul stood there speechless. They heard the sound but did not see anyone. Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. They led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. That story that we just read is the most famous conversion story in history. Think about it. You can't get more dramatic than this, than to take somebody who's hell-bent on destroying the church and having him suddenly converted to be a follower of the very one he was trying to destroy. He's joining the cause that he was trying to destroy just minutes earlier. It's the most famous, the most incredible, dramatic conversion story in all of history. It's right there in chapter 9. He's the enemy of the church, and he comes face to face with the head of the church that he's trying to destroy. And there is this encounter between this powerful, driven man, Paul, and Jesus Christ himself. Jesus says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Saul doesn't even know who this voice is coming from. Who is this thing? And he says, who are you? And the voice says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. Can you even imagine what happened in the heart of Saul at that moment? His whole life was devoted to destroying the followers of Jesus. Why? Because he's convinced at the bottom of his heart that Jesus cannot possibly be the Messiah. He didn't fit all the criteria that Paul and most of the Jews expected. He knew he was a false Messiah. He knew, and he was determined to destroy it. And all of a sudden, in a moment, he realizes that he's wrong. That Jesus is the Messiah. With this voice that says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And it doesn't say it, but I think at that point, under his breath, Paul said, uh-oh. Oops. Can you imagine that moment in his heart? To run into Jesus, smack into him, and be knocked to the ground, and to realize that your whole life is going in the wrong direction. Paul was blinded. He was rendered helpless. Now, Paul had never been helpless. He was incredibly capable. He was highly educated. He could do anything he set his mind to. The one thing that nobody had ever said again about Paul was that he was helpless. But in a moment, he was rendered helpless when he lost his sight. He had to be led by the hand into Damascus, the very place where he was heading to arrest Christians. He's the great leader, but he had to be led. He had to learn to be led. I believe that all leaders since Paul in the church have had to learn to be led before they can become great leaders. Paul had to learn what it meant to be totally dependent, because Jesus says, you will be told what to do. You know, Paul was used to telling other people what to do. He had a group of people who were going to Damascus, and he was barking orders all the time. Okay, you get the food, you do this, you line up behind me, this is where we're going to go, we're going to turn here. He was the one giving orders. And all of a sudden, Jesus says, you will be told what to do. Close your mouth, listen, and now I'm going to tell you what to do. This is a whole change for Paul. This is a radical change in his life. In a moment, everything changed for Paul. Now, there's something that Luke left out of this story. And the only reason I know that was that Paul would tell this story himself over and over again. When he would be put in front of great people, he would tell his own conversion story in front of Jews and in front of kings and others. And in Acts chapter 26, Paul stood in front of King Agrippa, and he told the story himself about how he was going off to arrest Christians, and he said, a light blinded me, and the voice said to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? But when Paul told the story to King Agrippa, he included a line that either he forgot to tell Luke or Luke forgot to include in Acts chapter 9. And it's this line right here. He said to him, Saul, Saul, this is in Saul's own words. He says, the voice said to me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. Excuse me. it's hard for you to kick against the goads. Do you know what a goad is? G-O-A-D, goad. We don't see it much in our society anymore, but back in an old agricultural farming society, farmers, if they were trying to move, let's say, oxen, if they're trying to get the oxen to go in their pen or the oxen to pull the plow or whatever he's doing, they would carry a sharp stick. And as long as the oxen was going in the right path, they were fine. But if the oxen started to turn, they would jab them with the goad. And so it was painful if you tried to go in the wrong direction. If you tried to lead the path that your master had in mind for you, it was painful for you. I'm going to just switch mics real quickly here. Hold on. So he says, "Why do you persecute me? It is painful for you to kick against the goads." What's he saying to Paul? He's saying, Paul, you're on the wrong path. You're going in the wrong direction. And it's going to bring nothing but pain and agony in your life as long as you go in the wrong direction. If you go in the direction that I want you to go in, it's going to go well for you. If you try to go in your own direction and follow your own path, it's going to be painful for you. And I want to tell you something. That same thing is true about each one of us. And God has this very loving way for all of us of using a goad at times, so that when we decide to go off the path and to follow our own way, sometimes life gets so painful and so uncomfortable, we kind of come to ourselves and realize, I've made a horrible mistake. And we get back on the road with God, and we get straight with God, and we begin going again. So right now in your life, if you're experiencing a lot of difficulties, a lot of agony and pain, it might be that you've kind of gotten off the path, and the Lord's trying to guide you back on the path, the straight and the narrow with Him. And that's something that you're going to have to spend some time with the Lord and determine if that's what's going on. But he says to Paul, it's hard for you to kick against the goads. Paul's eyes were opened in that moment when he met the Lord. Now, literally his eyes were shut, but he had 3 days of blindness to think about this. So for 3 days he doesn't eat or drink, he doesn't talk to anybody. He has 3 days to think about God. And during those 3 days, everything about Paul's life changed. He had a whole new direction in his life 3 days later. Now, next week we're going to study the moment when this young Christian named Ananias comes in fear and trembling before Paul to open his eyes and give him his calling. So next week we're going to talk about the calling of Paul. But when Paul's eyes were opened, he had a whole new direction. He had a whole new purpose in his life. In fact, he had a whole new master and leader in his life, and that master would be Jesus Christ. And forever after that, he would introduce himself as a servant, a slave of Jesus. Isn't that amazing? The guy who was out to destroy followers of Christ would say, I am a follower of Christ. I am a slave, of servant of Jesus Christ. Everything changed for him. For 30 years after that, he would spend the rest of his life, for 30 years, he would do everything he could to convince people to become followers of Jesus. The one who was throwing people in prison for being followers would use all of his energies to convince people to become followers of Jesus, including the Jews. He would go to the synagogues first everywhere he went, and he would argue with them, and he would do his very best, showing them in the Old Testament all the prophecies of Christ, trying to convince them to be followers of Jews. And he became the greatest enemy to the Jews. He was the number one man that the Jews were out to destroy because he was such a powerful man teaching for Jesus Christ. How ironic is that? The group that he used to be with was after him. The group that he used to be against was now his group. He was the most powerful man for them. For 30 years, he became a follower of Christ. And then in about AD 65, he was beheaded for his faith. He was arrested for his faith. He was beaten and he was stoned and he was beaten with rods, and he suffered all kinds of persecution, always refusing to deny Jesus Christ. He was persecuted by people just like him, devout Jews who believed he was spreading a lie. But he always refused to deny his faith. The thing that changed Paul's life is very, very simple. He met the living Christ. So my question is, have you? Your experience, I know, was different than Paul's. I know that none of you were walking down the street when a light blinded you and you fell to the ground and you had a personal one-on-one conversation with Jesus. However, every one of us has that same opportunity. Have you met the living Christ? If we had time this morning, we could have people stand up and say, how did you meet the living Christ? How did you meet the Lord? Tell us about the moment that happened. Tell us about the changes in your life. What was the kind of person you were before? And after you met the living Christ, what changes have happened in your life? I guarantee your changes were not as dramatic as Paul's, but all of us have been changed. All of us who have met Christ have been changed. The first question we have to ask is, have you met the living Christ? That's where it all started with Paul. That's where it all starts for all of us. Nothing can happen in your growth in Christ until you have that moment coming face to face with the living Christ and meeting him personally. When Paul met the living Christ, he was knocked down to the ground. He was leveled. He was broken and he was crushed so that God could mold him and shape him into the person he wanted him to be. Martin Luther said that God creates out of nothing. Therefore, until a man is nothing, God can make nothing out of him. So Paul had to be made nothing. He had to be broken and crushed, reduced to the lowest point, completely humbled, and then God could begin to shape him and mold him into the greatest leader, greatest missionary, greatest writer in the history of the church. I think that Paul is the least likely person ever to become the leader of the church. If you and I were somehow to have, if God could have called us to his side back there in the first century when Paul was 25 years old and the church was just starting out, and God says, pick somebody out on this earth to become the spokesman for the church, the one who will take the message to the whole world. Pick somebody out in this church, in this world. And you and I looked at all of the people on that earth. The very last person that we would have picked was Paul, Saul at the time, because he was out there arresting Christians. That's the last person we would have picked. It's the first person God picks. He picks the least likely. He picks the most flawed person of all. Back in 1463, the city council in Florence commissioned a young artist named Deduccio to carve a statue. It was supposed to be a large statue that would adorn their streets, and they wanted him to make a statue of a biblical character, and they were going to pay him well for this, and he agreed to this, and he went out to the quarry, and he had them cut this huge piece of white marble from the quarry. But when they cut it a little too thin, and when they moved it over to the yard where it was supposed to be, the piece of marble fell. And when it fell, a deep crack developed on the side of this piece of marble. And the artist looked at it, and he said, this piece is flawed now. I can't work with this. I'm not going to spend years making this great work of art with this flawed piece of marble. And he went to the commission, the city commissioners, and asked them to have another piece of marble cut for him, and they refused to do it. And so the statue wasn't made, and the marble laid in the yard there. And for the next 38 years, a whole number of artists would walk past it and look at it and see the flaw, and they would reject it. And the weeds grew up around it, and it was just laid there in the yard of the church. Until 38 years later, in 1501, they approached a young 26-year-old artist named Michelangelo, and they asked him to do the same thing that they had asked Deduccio 38 years earlier. Would you carve a statue, the big, large statue of a biblical character to adorn these streets? And Michelangelo, at the age of 26, agreed to do this. And he walked out in the yard and he saw that piece of marble on the ground. He saw the flaw as soon as anybody else did. But he saw something they didn't see. He would later say that he saw David. He'd look in the marble and he saw David. And he said all he had to do was just chip away all the parts that weren't David and set him free. And he carved one of the most magnificent statues ever made. He locked himself in a room for about 3 years, and he carved and he sanded until when that statue was brought out, people looked at it and they thought it was greater than any statue they've seen from the Greeks or the Romans or any period of time. They'd never seen anything like it. And it came from this flawed piece of marble. And what God did with Paul was he took a man who was deeply flawed and he made him into this masterpiece that there's every reason why we should study him because of who he became. And God does the same thing with you. A lot of us say, God can't really use me for anything much because I have these flaws in me. I have these weaknesses. I have these problems. God delights in taking the least likely people, the most flawed people, and creating a masterpiece out of them. He can do the same thing to you as he did with Paul. And I pray that as we study Paul's life, that all of you will be inspired to see how much God can use you in the weeks to come. Let's pray together.